here we are at the London Book Fair 2012. I'm Rupert Matthews, Editorial Director at Bretwalda Books. I've met Michael Evans, who is the author of our book on RAF Duxford, and I thought this was a good opportunity to have a little chat about the book. Michael, nice to meet you. Could you tell us why you wrote this book?
Well, I live quite near RAF Duxford, or former RAF Duxford, and it's has such an iconic place in RAF history, and I thought it would make a very good topic to investigate.
Now, if I remember correctly from your book, RAF Duxford was founded in the First World War, and then of course achieved great fame in the Second World War. Could you tell us something about what happened in the interwar years?
Well, as you say, it was built towards the end of the First World War, but then the war ended, and the RAF didn't really, or the RAF as it had then become, didn't really know what to do with it, and it became a training station for a while, and then eventually it became a fighter station, and it was quite an important fighter station, although nobody expected there to be a war, but there's some very interesting people who were stationed there during that time, and then gradually as the threat of war began to build up, Duxford actually had the very first Spitfires.
Okay, so we know that there were Spitfires at Duxford, but what other sort of aircraft were operating out of the base?
Well, there were in the 1930s there were Bulldogs and Siskins, and a whole variety of aircraft were there.
I see. Well, you mentioned there were some interesting characters. Could you tell us about one or two of them?
Well, I suppose the one you think about most is Douglas Bader. He joined the Air Force and he was at Cranwell, and then he was a bit of a daredevil and got involved in a horrendous air accident, and managed to persuade the RAF to let him come back. But when they posted him back to Duxford actually, and they put him in charge of motor transport. He wasn't very keen on that idea, and so he in fact resigned his commission and was invalided out of the full on a full pension. But then, as we all know, when the Second World War came, he managed to persuade people he knew to let him go back into the Air Force, and he actually went back in. He actually did serve at Duxford.
Okay, so when the Second World War broke out, Duxford was a fighter station already.
It was a fighter station.
So, you know, what was its initial role? What was it doing?
It was 19 Squadron was there for a good many years, and they were the very first squadron to have Spitfires, and that's when they started to arrive at the very start of the war. But when the war came, there weren't that many Spitfires around, but the squadron was built up.
And then later on, the Americans arrived. Did they introduce many changes to Duxford?
Well, it was 1943. Beginning of 1943, the Americans came. The United States 8th Air Force were building up in a very big way in Britain, and they needed airfields, and it was a convenient one for them to have, and it became USAAF Station 357.
Oh.
And it was the 78th Fighter Group who were there, and they fought for 30 months. They were there right until the end of the war.
Well, exciting times indeed. But once the war was over, RAF Duxford, of course, remained as a base. But what happened after the war?
After the war, the Americans moved out, and the RAF came back in again. And at that time, they had some fairly iconic station commanders. For instance, there was Al Deer, who was a New Zealander who fought in the Battle of Britain. And in fact, I think on the third crash that he had with a Spitfire, he actually broke his wrist bailing out, and they took him by ambulance to East Grinstead Hospital, and they rang up his station commander from there and said he's all right, he's here, and the man said, we're going to say, keep him there, he's written too many Spitfires off, we want him back. But you know, probably joking.
Possibly, yes. Okay, and finally, an opportunity to give a good plug to the book. Why should someone buy your book?
Well, I personally think it's an interesting book because I did the research, but I think there were so many interesting characters stationed at RAF Duxford. I think that is the main thing about it. I mean, it's got a lot of heroics and that sort of thing, but there were some really, really fantastic people who served there. One chap who comes to mind is a chap who, a pilot officer, Sinclair. He was the man who wrote off the very first Spitfire. He was on his first flight and he came down, the undercarriage collapsed, and he wrote the plane off. Unfortunately, he survived, and he survived the war and retired as a wing commander. But on one occasion, he bailed out, and he was in what was said to have been the biggest mid-air collision in the map of Britain. And he was the only survivor of this collision. He bailed out at about 22,000 feet, took about a quarter of an hour to get down to the ground. When he reached the ground, the first person who came up to him was a guards officer. And he'd actually been at school with this chap. And the chap invited him back to the officers' mess at Caterham. And when he got back there, they wouldn't let him in because he got up first thing in the morning and thrown his flying kit on top of his pyjamas, and they said he was improperly dressed and they wouldn't let him in. And poor old Sinclair apparently had great trouble borrowing enough money to pay for his train fare back to Duxford. So there was a lot of love lost between the Army and the Air Force, it seemed.
I see. Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was Michael talking about his book RAF Duxford, which is published by Bretwalda Books. It's available on Amazon, at all good bookshops, as they say. It's also available as an e-back on all major platforms.